poor widow sold her dead husband's boots to feed her 3 children one last meal. I didn't know what she'd sold until 3 days later. By then it was already done. By then I'd already eaten the soup she made from it, potatoes and a knob of salt pork and something that tasted like it had been boiled twice, thinned with well water, salted just enough so you couldn't say it was nothing. I ate it at her table in her house, in the chair nearest the stove that she dragged closer without asking me. And I didn't ask where the money came from because I didn't think it was my business, and I was too cold to be curious about anything except getting warm. She found out about the boots from the Gyre boy. He'd seen her at the trade post, seen her walk out with a coin and walk in with the salt pork and the potatoes, and 2 days after that he came around the cabin pretending he needed a bucket of water from her well. And while he was at the well, he looked at her husband's corner by the door, the peg where Cal Dunmore's coat used to hang, the hook where his hat used to rest, and the floor beneath it where his boots always stood, and the boots were gone. The Gyre boy mentioned it to me because he mentioned everything to me. 17 years old, grew up on a claim 2 miles east of the widow's place, had appointed himself the carrier of all news from one end of that valley to the other. I was staying at his father's place, sleeping in their barn, had been for 11 days by then, longer than I intended and longer than was decent. His father didn't ask me to leave. I didn't deserve that kind of patience. She sold Cal's boots, Luther Gyre said. He was leaning against the post at the end of the barn, watching me rewrap my right hand, which had gotten worse in the cold. Harlan Stroud bought them at the trade post. Nice boots, near new. Cal only had them 6 months before he died. I kept wrapping. Stroud paid her 40 cents, Luther said. She bought potatoes and salt pork. I put down the wrapping and looked at my hand. The skin across 2 knuckles had split again in the night, which was the 3rd time in the same week. In cold like this, in this kind of dry, your skin just opens. You don't always feel it when it happens. I'd been waking with blood dried in the creases, my fingers stiff and clumsy until the stove had been going an hour and some warmth had worked back into the joints. It was a small misery. There were worse ones around, but it was the kind of thing that reminded you each morning of what you'd let yourself become. That was the soup she brought over, I said. I reckon, Luther said, you and my father, she split it. I didn't say anything to that. She's got 3 kids, Luther said. Youngest is 3 years old. They've been going on short rations since October. I knew that. I knew most of it. I've been here long enough to know the shape of the widow Dunmore's situation without anyone having to lay it out for me. Her husband Cal had died in September, thrown from a horse on a trail he'd ridden 100 times, dead before anyone found him. Left her with a claim that needed working, 3 children under the age of 10, and a winter coming that wasn't going to care one way or the other. The nearest town was 15 miles south. Her nearest neighbor was Luther Gyre's family, 2 miles east. She had a milk cow that was giving less and less, and a root cellar that had gone into winter thinner than it should have been. I was a man who had arrived at the Gyre place 11 days ago, intending to stay 2 nights. My name is Calhoun Reese. I was 54 years old that winter. I had been a deputy marshal for 16 years, then a marshal for 7 more after that, and then I wasn't anything. I'd ridden out of Pueblo in early October with no destination and no particular reason to be going there, which is a thing a man can do when he has no attachments, no property, and no one waiting for him anywhere. I'd had a wife once. I'd had a partner once. I'd had a sense of what the next day was going to ask of me, which is a kind of anchoring most people don't notice until it's gone. My wife had been gone 6 years. My partner, the man I'd worked beside for 11 of my years as a lawman, a man named Orville Tench, whose judgment I trusted more than my own. Orville had died in April of that same year, a blood sickness that took him in 3 weeks. I'd sat with him on the last day. He'd been mostly past talking by then, but at one point he'd looked at me very clearly, the way a man looks at you when he's collected himself for something important, and he'd said, "Don't go to nothing, Cal." He called me Cal, same as he had since the first year. Then he closed his eyes, and that was the last clear thing he said. After that, I held on through the summer because there was still work to do, still a badge to wear. And then in September, a thing happened with a prisoner that I'm not going to detail here because the details don't matter to this. What matters is that I turned in the badge and rode out and found myself, by the start of November, at the Gyre place in a valley in southern Colorado, sleeping in a barn with a bad hand and no clear intention. Going to nothing, maybe. I don't know what I thought. I'm not sure I was thinking with any discipline about anything by then. The hand was the thing Luther's father had used to justify keeping me. Wendell Gyre was a careful man, not a sentimental one. He'd found me on his road in weather that would have killed me by morning, brought me inside, looked at the hand, and made a judgment. "You can't ride in this cold with that," he'd said. That was all. Luther had moved his things to the house and given me the barn loft, which had a small iron stove and enough hay to bank the walls against the worst of the wind. I'd been a burden. I knew it. I'd tried to be useful in the ways I could, fixing a broken axle on the Gyre wagon, mending a section of fence when the hand would let me. But mostly I'd been a man sitting in a barn getting warm, which is not a thing that earns its keep. And somehow, in all of that, a woman 2 miles west had sold her dead husband's boots to feed her children, and sent a portion of what she made with them over to the barn where I was sitting. I rewrapped my hand. Took me longer than it used to. When I was done, I sat there a while, looking at the barn wall. "She didn't tell me she did it," I said finally. "She wouldn't," Luther said. "No," I said, "she wouldn't." I'd met Nora Dunmore the 3rd day I was at the Gyre place. She'd come to borrow a tool, an adze, I think, or some kind of hand plane, something for a repair she was making to her cabin door. She'd walked 2 miles in snow that was already up over her boot tops, and she'd knocked on the Gyre door and asked for the tool with the same tone of voice she might use to ask for the time of day. No embarrassment about the walk. No apology for the inconvenience. Just a clear request, a thank you when the tool was produced, and then she turned around and walked back the way she'd come. She was maybe 40. Not beautiful in a way that drew your eye immediately, but the kind of face that held you once you were looking, strong jaw, gray coming in at her temples, eyes that were dark brown and took their time about what they decided. She moved the way people move when they're used to covering ground alone and don't think about it. She didn't look at me with anything particular, just noted I was there, the way you note a post or a tree, and directed her attention to Wendell. I watched her go from the doorway. She moved without hurry through the snow, arms swinging easy, the tool tucked under one arm. About 50 yards out, she adjusted her grip on it and kept going. "Widow Dunmore," Wendell said, coming to stand beside me. "How long?" I asked. "Since September. Horse through him. Children. 3, Elsa's 10, Thomas is 7, and then there's the little one, Mary. She'll be 4 come spring." I watched the woman get smaller in the white distance, moving steadily, not hurrying. "Hard situation," I said. "It is," Wendell said. He went back inside. I stayed in the doorway another minute, watching the place where she disappeared into the tree line. The cold came off the snow in waves, the kind of cold that had a sound to it in wind, and she'd walked into it like it was nothing. Then I went back to the barn. The first time I went over to the Dunmore place, it was to help with something Wendell couldn't manage on account of his back, and that Luther was too young to do right. A weight-bearing beam in her outbuilding had shifted, and the whole structure was threatening to lean. Wendell asked me to go look at it, and I went. The 2-mile walk took me through a stand of bare cottonwoods and across a creek that had frozen down to about 3 inches of ice over the gravel bed, and then up a slight rise, and there was her place. It was a well-kept place. That was the first thing I noticed. The cabin was modest, but the chinking was solid, the woodpile was stacked tight and covered, the outbuilding doors were on their hinges. She'd been working, you could see it. The kind of work a woman does when she knows no one's coming to do it for her. The beam repair was straightforward enough work if you had someone to hold and someone to lever, and Nora Dunmore held and I levered, and we got it done in about 2 hours, neither of us talking much. She knew what she was doing, had the angle right before I could show her, had her weight distributed correctly, didn't lose her grip. Her hands were strong, the knuckles reddened from cold and work. Afterward, she brought out coffee, which I suspected she'd stretched with roasted grain to make it go further. We sat on the step of the outbuilding. The cold had come back down. Her youngest, Mary, appeared at the cabin door and looked at us with the focused uncertainty of a very small child encountering something she hadn't decided about yet. "Come here if you're coming," Nora said. Mary came. She positioned herself directly against her mother's leg and stared at me. 3 years old, hair still the light brown of a very young child, wearing a coat that had been cut down from something adult and wasn't quite right across the shoulders. "That's Mr. Reese," Nora told her. "He fixed the building." Mary considered this information and found it insufficient. "He's staying with the Gyres," Nora said. "How come?" Mary said. "Because his hand got hurt," Nora said. Mary looked at my wrapped hand, then she looked at my face. Then she turned around and went back to the cabin. Nora didn't apologize for her or explain her. She just watched her go and then looked at her coffee. "The beam's going to hold through the winter," I said. "But in spring you'll want to reset the whole foundation before it shifts again." "I know," she said. "Cal was going to do that this past fall." She said it the way you say a fact, plainly, without an edge to it, the way you say the fence runs north or the water tastes of iron. She wasn't asking for anything from me when she said it. "You've got a good root cellar," I said. "I've got a root cellar," she said. I understood the correction. "If there's more I can do while I'm in the valley," I said, "you can ask." She looked at me then for longer than she'd looked at me before, dark eyes taking their time. "I don't need charity, Mr. Reese," she said. "It's not charity," I said. "I'm not doing much that's useful where I am, and you've got a list of things that need doing. I can work." She was quiet a moment. "I can see that you can," she said, and then, "Thank you for the beam." That was the end of it for that day. I went back 5 more times over the next week. Each time there was a task, and I did the task, and she gave me coffee, or, once, a piece of bread that I knew she couldn't really spare, and I ate it because refusing it would have been worse than eating it. I learned things about her without meaning to. She was from Missouri originally. She had the faint flatness of it still in certain words, the short vowels, the way she said creek with no extra syllables. She'd come west with Cal 12 years ago before Elsa was born, when Cal Dunmore had believed Colorado was where a man could still build something from nothing. He hadn't been wrong about that, but he'd been wrong about his horse, and now she was here and he wasn't. She was not a woman who talked about her grief. She carried it the way she carried everything, straight-backed, forward-facing. I respected it, but it also worried me in a way I couldn't have explained, the way a crack in a wall you can't see the depth of worries you. There are people who hold themselves so tight that when the tight thing finally lets go, it lets go all at once, and there is nothing left to hold the shape. Her children were well behaved in the way children are when they understand something serious is happening. Elsa, the oldest, had the look of a girl who had absorbed responsibility too early. She watched her mother with the careful attention of someone waiting to be needed, and when Nora was occupied, Elsa ran the room. Thomas was quieter than a 7-year-old should probably be, more apt to watch than to speak, with the same deliberate quality in his eyes that his mother had. Mary was the only one who seemed to still be mostly a child. She'd come around me sometimes, not speaking, just present, and one afternoon she'd held out a small flat rock she'd found, and I'd taken it and examined it seriously and said it was a good rock, and she'd considered this and taken it back. The night I heard about the boots, I lay in the Gyre barn loft and looked at the low ceiling and thought about what it meant that a woman with nothing had split what she'd gotten for her husband's boots between her children and a man she barely knew. I'd eaten the soup. I'd sat in the warmth of it and not thought about what it cost. I turned that over for a while. It was not a comfortable thing to hold. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I walked to the Dunmore place. Not to fix anything, I just walked over there. She was at the woodpile when I came into the yard. She had an axe and she was splitting logs, which she was managing fine, but which was harder work than it needed to be because the axe head was loose on the handle and was turning slightly on each strike, which wastes effort and is also dangerous. I'd noticed it the last time I was over. I should have said something then. I said good morning. She said good morning. I said her axe head was loose. She set down the axe and looked at it. She'd known, probably, she just didn't have a better one. "I'll fix it," I said. "There's a pine knot in the barn," she said, "if you drive it in tight enough." I found the knot and drove it in. It took a while to do it right. The wood had dried unevenly, and I had to shave it down twice before it seated properly. When I brought the axe back, I set it against the woodpile and said, "I heard what you did." She looked at me. "The boots," I said. She went back to the wood, picked up the axe, set a log, split it, the head held. "It wasn't your concern," she said. "No," I said, "but I'm going to say it anyway. You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to," she said. "I don't want you going short on account of me," I said. "Then do something about it," she said, and she set another log. I stood there. "I don't mean that as an insult," she said, still splitting. "I mean it plainly. If it bothers you that I sold the boots, then do something. Stay in this valley a while." Help where you can. Don't drift off down the road and make it mean nothing. She set another log, split it clean. I watched her for a long moment. She didn't look up. All right, I said. All right, she said. That was the whole conversation. I picked up the larger pieces she'd split and started stacking them. We worked like that, side by side, for an hour without a word. The cold was dry and hard. My breath came out in short white bursts. The sound of the axe was clean in the still air. After a while, Mary appeared at the cabin door to watch, decided this was acceptable, and went back inside. I'm going to tell the rest of this the way I remember it, which is not in order. Memory doesn't run straight. It runs like water, finding the low places, the spots where something collected. I'll try to give you the low places. One of them is the afternoon I found her in the outbuilding, sitting on a crate, not doing anything. Just sitting. I'd come to mend a section of the fence that the cow had pushed through, and I needed a tool from the outbuilding, and I opened the door and found her sitting there in the cold and the half-dark, not crying, not praying that I could see, just sitting very still with her hands open in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. I said her name. She looked up. She didn't startle. I'll be out in a minute, she said. I handed her the coat that was hanging on the wall near the door. She wasn't wearing one, had come out here without it. And I went and fixed the fence. And when I came back, she was in the cabin making bread, and Mary was underfoot, and Thomas was at the table with a slate, and nothing was said about it. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what that stillness was. You didn't have to name it. A person only sits that still when they're holding something very heavy and they've come somewhere private to hold it without anyone watching. I'd done it myself more times than I could count. The difference was that when I did it, there was no one to notice. When she did it, she had 3 children who needed her to get back up. She always got back up. Another low place is the night one of the children got sick. Thomas. He'd gotten a fever in the night, and Nora had come to the Gyre place in the dark, had walked 2 miles in the dark and the cold, which tells you something about what the fever looked like, and gotten Wendell's wife, Helene, out of bed. Helene had gone back with her. I'd gone too, though I wasn't asked, and I spent the night feeding the stove in that cabin so the fire never went below a certain point. Because what a fevered child needs more than almost anything is warmth, and what that cabin needed for warmth was someone to keep feeding it. I'd sat in the chair by the stove and fed it through the night, piece by piece, keeping the temperature steady, not letting it roar hot and then drop, just steady and even and reliable. Something you could do with one hand that needed doing. The stove ticked and popped. The wind worked at the corners of the cabin. In the children's room, I could hear Nora talking to Thomas in a low, even voice, the kind of voice you use when you want someone to know you're there without rousing them to alertness. Just, I'm here, I'm here. Nora was up all night with Thomas. Helene was there until around 2 in the morning, and then she went back because Wendell's back had been bad and he needed her. I stayed. Nora didn't ask me to, I just didn't go. The fever broke toward dawn, the way fevers often do, dropping in the last dark hour before the light, like the body makes some negotiation in the night and comes out the other side. I heard the sound of Thomas's breathing change, heard Nora make a small sound that might have been a prayer or might have just been relief pressing out of her. She came out of the children's room and found me at the stove. I'd kept the fire going, and I'd found her coffee pot and made coffee with what was left in the tin, which wasn't much, and I'd set a cup on the table for her. She sat down and didn't say anything for a while. The coffee was weak, and there was only the 1 cup's worth. She wrapped both hands around it. "Thank you," she said. "He's going to be all right," I said. "I know he is," she said. She said it with certainty, not defiance. She'd known it once the fever broke. She was already past the fear, already reorganizing herself for the next thing. We sat for a while. The stove ticked. Outside the window, the dark was starting to lighten, the gray coming up from the east, the sky going from black to the particular deep blue that means the sun is still coming even if you can't feel it yet. "Were you a lawman long?" she said. 23 years, I said. "That's a long time," she said. "It is. What made you leave it?" I looked at my coffee. I thought about how much to say and then said the true version because she'd earned it, because she wasn't the kind of woman you told a comfortable version to. "I did something I couldn't stop seeing," I said. "Not wrong, exactly. Legal, but I couldn't stop seeing it." She was quiet a moment. "And so you rode out." "And so I rode out," I said. "And kept riding until you ran out of road," she said. It wasn't a question. She said it without judgment, just recognition. "Something like that," I said. She nodded slowly. She looked at her coffee. Cal did that once, she said. Not the same reason, but something happened between him and his brother. I don't need to say what, and he rode out to just ride. Took him 3 months. He came back quieter, but he came back. He was smart, I said. He was, she said. She said it simply, without the fracture in the voice you sometimes hear when people talk about the dead. Just truth, flatly delivered. No performance of grief and no hiding of it either. Just he was. He would have fixed that beam himself, she said, if he'd gotten to fall. I know, I said. You did it better than he would have, she said. He always went too fast. I didn't know what to do with that exactly. It seemed like a gift of some kind, putting me alongside him that way, not against him, measuring me against the best thing she knew and finding me adequate. I've gotten compliments in my life that I remember less than that one. We sat until the light was full and gray through the window, and then she went back to check on Thomas, and I fed the stove one more time and went out into the morning and walked back to the Gyre place, and the cold hit me like a wall after the warmth of the cabin, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like a man who had been somewhere that night instead of nowhere. There's a thing that happens when you stay somewhere long enough past your intention. The place starts to know your habits. The Gyre barn knew the sound I made when I woke early and fed the stove, a particular drag of the iron door on its hinge. The Dunmore cabin knew that I knocked twice light before I came in. Mary knew that I would always look at any rock she brought me. Thomas began leaving room for me at the table without being asked. Elsa started telling me things, the matter-of-fact information of a 10-year-old moving through a world she was studying hard. Which tree had the bird's nest she'd found, which corner of the fence the cow liked to test, which of her school books she liked, and which she thought were a waste of paper. I don't know when I stopped thinking of myself as a man waiting to leave and started thinking of myself as a man who was here. It happened the way most things happen, not in a moment but in accumulation, each day adding its small weight until the balance had shifted without you noticing when. One morning I woke up and the first thing I thought about was that the Dunmore fence had a section on the north side that wasn't going to make it to spring, and I should get to it before the next snow. Not where I was going or what I should do next or any of the things a drifting man thinks about. Just the fence. Just today. That was how I knew. The hard part of December was the cold. A stretch of 12 days where the temperature didn't get above 10 degrees and went down to something I'd rather not say at night. The kind of cold that makes you think in a different way, not about what you want, but about what's necessary, what's the minimum, what can be let go. The Gyre barn became a problem. The iron stove was too small for that volume, and I was burning wood faster than I should to keep the space livable. My right hand had gotten bad enough that I'd started to think about what it would mean if it didn't improve, whether I'd be able to ride, whether I'd be able to do the work. Wendell offered me the house. I said I was fine in the barn. He didn't push it. He wasn't a man who pushed. But the next morning Luther showed up with his father's good blanket, the heavy wool one that Helene had made the year they came west, and handed it to me without a word and went back to the house. I used it. On the 4th day of that cold stretch, around midday, Nora appeared at the Gyre gate. She was carrying something, a bundle wrapped in cloth. I met her at the gate because Luther had seen her coming and come to get me. "What is it?" I said. "My cows stopped giving," she said. Her breath came out in clouds. "I need to move her to your shelter tonight or she'll be in trouble. Your outbuilding's better chinked than mine." I said, "Of course." Then she held out the bundle. I took it. "What's this?" I said. "Mittens," she said. "Thomas's old ones. They're a bit small, but their wool and your hands are a problem." I looked at the bundle. The mittens inside were dark blue, well-worn but thick, clearly hand-knit. "Your hands," she said, as if I hadn't heard her the first time. "You can't work with your hands like that. Put them on." I looked up at her. She was looking at me with that patient, direct quality, the way she looked at anything that needed dealing with. No sentiment in it, just a practical assessment that had produced a practical solution. "Nora," I said. "Calhoun," she said, which was the first time she'd used my given name. I put on the mittens. They were too small, as she'd said, but they covered the worst of it, the knuckles, the cold, cracked skin. The wool was thick, and the warmth came into my hands almost immediately, the particular comfort of wool against damaged skin. "Thank you," I said. "The cow," she said. "Yes," I said. "Let's go get her." We moved the cow into the Gyre outbuilding, which had better insulation and a larger attached area where she could be comfortable. The cow's name was Margaret, which I learned from Mary, who had come along because Mary came along when her mother went anywhere, and there was no particular argument against it. Mary explained that Margaret was a good cow, but that Margaret did not like the cold, and I said that was reasonable, and Mary nodded as if I had correctly understood the situation. We got Margaret settled. Nora fed her some of the hay we'd brought over. Mary climbed up on the lower rail of the stall and watched the cow with the serious attention of a person supervising important work. I stood beside Nora. "How's your wood supply?" I said. "Enough," she said. "Enough is not a number," I said. She looked at me sideways. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the territory near one. The kind of almost expression that told you she was aware something was funny and had decided not to fully give it to you. "Enough for 2 more weeks if I'm careful," she said. "After that I need to get more cut." "I'll cut it," I said. "Calhoun," she said. "It's not a favor," I said. "It's a practical thing. I can do it faster than you can, and we both know it." She was quiet. "You let me keep being useful," I said, "and I'll let you keep being stubborn about accepting it. That way we both get what we want." She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at Mary, who was still communing with Margaret. "Mary," she said, "what do you think of Mr. Reese?" Mary considered this deeply, the way she considered everything. A long pause, a look at me over her shoulder. "He's all right," Mary said. Nora looked back at me. "There you have it," she said. I don't want to tell this the wrong way. I don't want to make it sound like I went over to that cabin every day and fell slowly in love with a widow and her children, and it was all very gentle and arranged. That's not how it was. There were days I didn't go. Days I sat in the barn loft and looked at the wall and felt the particular gray of a man who has lost the thing that organized his life and doesn't know what to put in its place. Days I thought about Orville Tench, who had known me better than I knew myself in some ways, who had sat up with me in the back of a jail in a limosa once after a bad night, and said nothing for 2 hours, which was exactly the right amount of nothing. "Don't go to nothing, Cal." I'd heard it every day since April. There were also days when I pushed too hard on something at the Dunmore place, and Nora told me plainly to ease off. She was not a woman who let you overreach. She had a sense of the shape of things, what was needed and what was excess, what she could accept, and what crossed a line she'd drawn for herself. She'd accepted my labor. She'd accepted the occasional thing I'd brought over from the Gyre stores with Wendell's say-so. But there was a category of help she didn't accept, and she knew exactly where it was, and I learned to see it. Once I overstepped, and she told me so clearly without malice the way she did everything. I said I understood. She said she knew I did, and that was the end of it, and I respected her the more for it. Not many people know how to correct someone without making them smaller. She did. She didn't need rescuing. I want to make that clear. The woman who sold her husband's boots to feed her children was doing the thing that needed doing. She was keeping her family alive through a winter that was trying hard to end them, and she was doing it on her own terms, and she was doing it well. What she needed, what I think I gave her in the end, though I'm not sure I gave it on purpose, was someone standing nearby who understood what she was doing and found it worthy and didn't look away from the difficulty of it. Not rescuing, witnessing, being steady while she was steady. And what she gave me was harder to say, but I'll try. January. There was a man named Prout who came to the valley in the middle of January. I won't give you the whole of it, but the shape of it was this. Prout had a claim he said was adjacent to the Dunmore property, and he had papers he said proved it, and what those papers would have meant if they were valid was that Nora Dunmore's cabin sat on a corner of land that was his, and she could either buy that corner from him at a price he'd name, or she could move her cabin, which was not a thing you could do in January. I knew about Prout before he came to the cabin. Wendell had mentioned him with the particular careful tone of a man who has information he's not certain about and isn't going to state as fact. The information was that Prout had done this before in the next county, had found a widow or a struggling claim holder, produced papers of questionable validity, and extracted either money or the land itself through a combination of legal pressure and the specific discomfort that comes from being alone and without resources and facing someone who has both. When Prout came to the Dunmore place, I was there. Not for that reason. I was repairing the step to the cabin. which had rotted through and which Nora had been stepping around by habit. The way you step around a thing you've meant to fix long enough that stepping around it becomes the habit. And I stood up when I heard the wagon coming and I watched him come into the yard. He was maybe 45, well-dressed for the territory, the kind of man who'd spent time with lawyers and knew what lawyered language sounded like. He had a man with him on the wagon seat who didn't say anything but whose presence was its own kind of language. Pruitt looked at me and looked at Nora, who'd come to the door. "Mrs. Dunmore," he said. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. She'd known he was coming, had been told by someone. She didn't look afraid. She looked the way she looked at anything difficult, straight at it. Pruitt produced his papers. He explained what they showed. He was polite about it, practiced and polite, and his politeness was a kind of pressure, the pressure of a man who expects to be accommodated because he always has been. I said, "Can I see those?" He looked at me, "And you are?" "A friend of Mrs. Dunmore's," I said. He assessed this. I was a big man still even then. I'd carried a badge for 23 years, and some of that stays in the way you stand, in the width of it, in the patience of it, in something about the eyes that men who have been looked at hard learn to turn back without thinking about it. He handed me the papers. I read them carefully. I knew land claims. I'd spent most of my life in territory where knowing land claims was the difference between a dispute that went to a lawyer and a dispute that went to a cemetery. And what I saw in Pruitt's papers was what I'd half expected to see, a claim that was real enough as far as it went, but that was leveraging an ambiguity in the original survey, an ambiguity that was not, in my reading, sufficient to support his position. Not enough to hold up if anyone pushed back. Only enough to frighten someone who didn't know to push back, and who had no one beside them who did. I handed the papers to Nora. She read them, took her time. Her face was neutral. "These don't show what you say they show," she said. Pruitt smiled the way men smile, when they think they're being patient with someone who doesn't understand. "Mrs. Dunmore," he began. "The survey line," I said, "runs at the second benchmark, not the first. You'd need a registered surveyor to re-establish the line, and I'd wager a significant sum that when you do, it comes out south of this cabin and not under it." Pruitt looked at me. "I'd also suggest," I said, "that if you've done this before in the next county, you've left a record that a lawyer with motivation to look would find. Mrs. Dunmore would have that motivation, and I suspect I could find her a lawyer in Pueblo who'd take the case for the story alone." Silence. The man on the wagon seat looked at the horizon. "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Pruitt," I said. "I'm just a man telling you that this particular claim is going to cost you more than it's worth." Pruitt looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora. Then he looked at his papers, which she'd handed back to him. "Good day, Mrs. Dunmore," he said, and he turned his wagon around and went back down the road. We watched him go. Nora stood beside me. I was aware of her, the particular stillness of her, the controlled quality, the sound of the wagon fading. "You knew land law," she said. "I did," I said. "Did you know it before you read those papers, or while you were reading them?" "Before," I said. She nodded. "Good," she said. "I would have hated it if you'd been bluffing." "I wasn't bluffing," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why he left." She went back inside. I went back to the step. I finished the step, cut the new board from a piece of timber Nora had in the outbuilding, fit it, set the nails. While I was working, Elsa came out and watched me for a while, standing at a careful distance in the way she did. "Who was that man?" she said. "Someone with a wrong idea about your mother's land," I said. "Is he going to come back?" I set another nail, tapped it level. "No," I said. She considered this. "How do you know?" "Because men like that are looking for the easiest way through," I said. "When you show them the way isn't easy, they go find a different way somewhere else." She was quiet for a moment. I could feel her thinking. "My mother knew he was wrong," Elsa said. "About the papers, she knew before you said anything." "I know she did," I said. "But she let you say it," Elsa said. I looked up at her. She had her mother's eyes, that same taking their time quality, that same willingness to sit with a thing until it came clear. "She did," I said. Elsa nodded like I'd confirmed something she'd been working out. Then she went back inside. I thought about that for a while, working the step. She was right. Nora had read those papers as well as I had, probably faster. She'd known the survey line argument before I made it. What she'd done was step back and let me make it, let me stand in front of it. And I'd understood at the time that it was a practical decision, that two voices were better than one, that Prout needed to see someone who could make it expensive for him. But Elsa had seen something else in it, or the same thing from a different angle. She'd let me be the man who stood there. I didn't take that lightly. I sat with it the rest of the afternoon, and I took it back to the Gyre place, and I sat with it there too. We didn't talk about it again. Not directly. But something had shifted, not in the way things shift when someone does you a favor and you feel obligated, which I didn't want, but in the way things shift when someone stands next to you through something hard, and you know they'll do it again, and that knowledge settles into your bones. She didn't become softer. Nora Dunmore was not a woman who became softer. But she began to look at me differently, and after a while I understood what was different about it. She was looking at me as a man who was staying, not a drifter who'd gotten weathered in. A man who was here. That's what she gave me when she looked at me that way, the idea that I was a man who was staying. I hadn't known that I was, but when she looked at me like that, I was. February. By February, I had moved out of the Gyre barn and into a room I'd built, and I mean built, with Wendell's consent and lumber he didn't need, a small addition off the south side of the Gyre house, tight and warm and mine. It was the first space of my own in a long time. I chinked the walls myself and set the small stove level with a piece of flat stone I found in the creek bed, and I put up a single shelf above the window and set on it the only thing I had that wasn't practical, a small piece of carved wood that Orville Tench had given me years ago as a joke. It wasn't much to look at, but it was the first thing I'd put up anywhere in a long time. The room smelled of new-cut pine for weeks. I went to the Dunmore place most days. Some days I went for a reason, a task, a repair, a thing that needed doing, and some days I went for no particular reason except that it was where I wanted to be and that Nora had stopped expressing surprise when I arrived, and that was all the invitation I needed. The children had gotten used to me. Elsa still watched me carefully, still had the quality of a girl who was deciding something, but she'd begun to include me in things, telling me about a problem at school, which she attended 3 days a week at a schoolhouse 4 miles south, carried there and back by a neighbor's cart. She had a teacher she thought wasn't wrong about mathematics but was wrong about history, and she explained her position on this in some detail one afternoon while I was fixing a hinge on the outbuilding door. And I listened to the whole thing and told her she should tell the teacher that, and she considered this and said she probably would. Thomas had recovered from his fever without any lasting trouble and had developed the habit of appearing at my elbow when I was working on something mechanical, watching with the specific intent of a boy who is learning without admitting he's learning. I started explaining things out loud without making a production of it, just, here's why the hinge is set this way, here's what the wedge is doing, here's why you tap it and don't drive it. He didn't say much. He watched. Once when I handed him the mallet without explaining why, he set the wedge and drove it on the first hit exactly right. I told him that was good. He said asterisk mm and handed the mallet back. Mary had officially decided I was hers in some capacity she hadn't fully defined, which meant she sometimes appeared at my side in the yard and simply stood there, which I found I didn't mind at all. She had the warmth of a child who hasn't yet learned to be cautious with her warmth, and she gave it the way she gave everything, without condition, without thinking about it. She just decided you were worth standing next to, and then she stood next to you. I found I didn't mind any of it. There was an evening in mid-February when the children were in bed and Nora and I were sitting by the stove with coffee. We did this sometimes, not often, but sometimes, when there was no particular reason to leave and the night outside was cold and the stove was warm and the quiet between us was the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. We'd learned each other's quiet by then, the different weights of it. She said, "What do you think you're doing here, Calhoun?" I looked at my coffee. It was weak. The tin was nearly out and she'd used what was left without saying so. I noticed these things now, the weight of the tin when I lifted it. The way the bread stretched further than it should, the things she didn't mention. "I mean it as a real question," she said, "not as a criticism." "I know," I said. "So what's the answer?" I didn't answer right away. The fire popped. Somewhere in the children's room, one of them turned over in sleep and was quiet again. I thought about October. About the road out of Pueblo with nothing in either direction, just distance. I'd been a man with a good horse and nowhere in particular to point him. I'd been a man who had spent 23 years being needed in the specific and daily way a lawman is needed, called on, consulted, relied upon, and then one September morning I'd set the badge on a desk and walked out into a world that did not need me in any particular way at all. I hadn't understood how much of my shape came from being needed until the need was gone, and I had no shape. That was what I'd ridden out of. That was what had put me on a road to nowhere in November cold with a hand that was splitting and a horse that needed better care than I was giving it. And this valley somehow, this woman, these children, this stove that I'd learned to read by the sound of its draft, by the color of the heat through the iron seams. "So what's the answer?" she said again without impatience. I thought about Orville Tench, who had said I needed a reason to get up in the morning. I thought about the barn loft at the Gyre place where I'd arrived not knowing I was a man out of reasons. I thought about the soup she'd made from 40 cents and sent half of it over to someone she barely knew, not asking for anything, not making anything of it, just, "Here is warmth, take it." "I think I'm doing the thing I should be doing," I said. She looked at me. "I think this valley is where I'm supposed to be," I said. "I don't know that I knew it until I was already here, but I think it's true." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the cabin wall and moved away. "And the badge," she said, "the thing that happened." "I don't know if I'll go back to it," I said. "Maybe. There's a county sheriff 2 valleys over who's asked me. I haven't answered him." "You'll be good at it," she said. "Maybe," I said. "But I'd only go back to it if I had something worth coming back to." I said it carefully because I meant it carefully. I wasn't staking a claim she hadn't offered. I was just stating a thing that was true and leaving it there on the table between us and letting her look at it. She looked at it for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside the window, the winter pressed its cold face against the glass. "Mary asked me this morning if you were going to be here when she woke up," Nora said. "I told her I didn't know. She said that wasn't an acceptable answer." I looked at my coffee so she wouldn't see what was in my face. "Smart girl," I said. "She is," Nora said. "Gets it from her father." And then, after a moment, "And maybe from the company she's been keeping." I looked up. She was looking at me with those dark eyes that took their time about what they decided. And what I saw in them was what I'd been afraid to look for, not pity, not gratitude, not the soft condescension of a woman who felt she owed something to a man who'd helped her. It was something else. The way you look at a thing you've assessed carefully and found to be what you need. The way you look at a man you've watched work through a hard winter, watched stand his ground without being asked, watched stay when he could have left, and decided is the real article. She wasn't a woman who looked at a man like that unless she meant it. I meant it too. I said, "Tell Mary she'll see me in the morning." Nora nodded, looked at her coffee. "I'll tell her," she said. March came the way March comes in Colorado, not all at once, not a clean break with winter, but in pieces. A day that feels like spring, then a week of cold, then another day, then a long rain, then mud, then one morning when the light is different in a way you can't explain, and you know the worst of it is over. My hand had healed, mostly. The cold had stopped splitting the knuckles and the skin had grown back thicker and the joints worked the way they were supposed to. The mittens had helped. Thomas's old mittens, too small, worn through at the right thumb by February. I'd kept them until they fell apart, and then I'd kept the pieces in my coat pocket for another month, which is a thing I'm not going to explain because I don't think I need to. I answered the county sheriff's letter. I told him I might take the work, that I'd come and talk to him in the spring, that I had obligations in the valley I needed to see through first. I told him I had a situation that needed settling before I could commit to anything. I went over to the Dunmore place in the second week of March, and I told Nora what I'd written and what I intended. She said, "You'd ride out 2 valleys and come back." I said I'd ride out and come back, every time. She looked at the window. The mud yard, the outbuilding, the bare-branched trees starting to show the faintest color at the tips of their branches. Margaret the cow visible through the outbuilding door, back in her own shelter now, recovered from the cold, doing whatever cows do when left to themselves. "That's a hard job," she said, "sheriff's work." "I know it," I said. "You'd be tired when you came back," she said. "I would," I said. "And some days you'd come back with something on you that I'd have to wait for you to put down," she said. Because I know the work. That's fair, I said, yes. She looked at me. And some days, she said, I'm going to be tired too, and short-tempered, and more interested in sleeping than in conversation. I'm aware, I said. I've got 3 children, she said. Elsa's old enough that it matters to her what she thinks of you, and you'd have to earn that, not just receive it. Thomas is going to test you in ways he doesn't even know yet. And Mary. Mary's already decided, I said. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. Something fuller and quieter than that. She has, Nora said. Nora, I said. Calhoun, she said. I'm not asking for what I haven't earned, I said. I'm asking for the chance to keep earning it. She was quiet, the cabin was quiet. The March light came in through the window and lay across the floor, thin and still a little cold, but there. Coming in at a different angle now than it had in November when I'd first walked into this valley. A season had passed. You could see it in the light. She stood up and came to where I was standing, which wasn't far, just across the table, and she put her hand flat on my chest. Not holding, just placing it there. Feeling that I was solid, that I was real, that I was here and not going. I put my hand over hers, that was all. We just stood there for a moment in the quiet, in the March light, her hand under mine. Her hand was work-roughened and warm, and it sat still under mine the way a thing sits still when it's exactly where it's meant to be. Cal's boots are gone, she said, not sadly, just stating a true thing. I know, I said. I'm sorry about that. Don't be, she said. They fed my children, that's what they were for in the end. She looked up at me, direct, unhurried, those dark eyes that had been taking their time about me since September. Stay in the valley, she said. I'm staying in the valley, I said. Then stay for dinner, she said. Elsa made bread. She took her hand back, turned toward the stove. And the conversation was over, the same way all conversations with Nora Dunmore ended. Not with a bow, not with anything tidy, just with the next thing that needed doing. I sat down at the table. Thomas came in from outside with mud on his boots and looked at me and sat down across from me without comment. Mary appeared from somewhere and climbed onto the bench beside me and positioned herself against my arm in her particular way, the way she positioned herself against her mother's leg, settling herself against something solid, something that would be there. Elsa came out of the back room carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf and put it on the table and looked at me with those careful 10-year-old eyes. Is it all right, she said. I let it rise too long. Let's see, I said. She unwrapped it. It was good bread, dense and brown, with a split along the top where it had opened in the oven. It's good bread, I said. She looked at me like she was deciding whether to believe me. Your mother would tell you if it wasn't, I said. She thought about that, looked at her mother's back at the stove. That's true, she said. And she sat down, and Nora came to the table, and we ate. I'm going to end here because this is where it ends, not at some later date. Not at any particular landmark, but here at this table, in this light, with bread that rose too long and coffee that had been stretched with roasted grain, and 4 people who had gotten through a winter by holding on to what was solid and necessary. I stayed in the valley. I took the sheriff's work 2 valleys over, and I rode out, and I came back every time. And there was always a lamp in the window, and always someone who heard my horse in the yard and waited without making a fuss about it. The man I'd been in October, the man riding out of Pueblo with nowhere to go and nothing organized around him, I think about him sometimes. I think about what Orville Tench would have said if he'd lived, if he could have seen how it went. He would have said something brief and accurate, the way he always did. He would have said that I'd found my reason. He wouldn't have been wrong. The boots are gone. 40 cents worth of cold leather and stitching, and from it, potatoes, salt pork, a soup that warmed a man who'd run out of warmth, a soup that was also something a woman sent to someone she barely knew without saying a word about it, without waiting to be thanked, without making anything of it at all. Just, here is warmth, take it. I think about that sometimes, what it cost her and what she didn't say about what it cost her and what she did instead. I think about a woman standing at a woodpile with a loose axe head, splitting wood in cold that had no bottom to it, and telling a man that if it bothered him then he should stay. Like it was the simplest thing in the world, like it was obvious. It wasn't obvious to me, but she made it obvious, that was the gift. The other thing I think about, and I don't talk about this much, but I think about it, is what would have happened if I'd left, If I'd ridden out when my hand was better, if I'd told myself I'd overstayed my welcome at the Gyres and found the road south and kept going. What kind of man I would have become. Not a bad one, I don't think. I'm not a bad man, but a smaller one. A man with fewer reasons. A man doing a job that no longer had a home attached to it, riding between towns and sleeping in rooms that knew nothing about him, keeping things short because nothing was long. There's a version of me out there somewhere on a road going south, and I don't have much use for him. The man I am instead goes to sleep in a house he helped build, not the Gyres anymore, but his own, the place he and Nora put up on the Dunmore claim the spring after they married. The one with the addition off the south side where Thomas has a room now because Thomas at 9 years old needed more space to himself than the children's room offered. The man I am instead wakes up to a woman who doesn't make much fuss about anything, including the fact that he's there. She just proceeds. She just goes on. And he goes on with her. And in the morning there is usually coffee, and sometimes there is bread, and always there is something that needs doing, which is the one thing above all others I have ever wanted from a life. Mary still brings me rocks sometimes. I examine each one. I've been examining them for 3 years now. They're all good rocks. That's enough to know